welcome everyone to the second webinar in this series hosted by the Forums for Nuclear Free New York. Tonight's program is titled Why Nuclear Power is Not a Clean Energy Solution. My name is Lance Gould. I am the CEO of Brooklyn Story Lab and a longtime contributor to the Radiation and Public Health Project. As the climate crisis accelerates, we're hearing renewed claims from the nuclear industry and some policymakers that nuclear power should be considered a green or zero emissions alternative to fossil fuels. But many scientists, environmental advocates, and frontline communities argue that this narrative leaves out critical realities, including nuclear's full carbon footprint, such as thermal and radioactive emissions, its dependence on water and cooling, the unsolved problem of radioactive waste, and the long-term risks that remain even after reactors shut down. These misperceptions about nuclear power persist, and our goal tonight is to explore why nuclear power is not the climate solution it's often marketed to be, and why truly clean, renewable alternatives are both safer and more economical. Why is this so urgent? Because just last month in her State of the State address, New York Governor Kathy Hochul announced plans to build another 4 gigawatts of new nuclear power in New York State, and that's in addition to the 1 gigawatt of new nuclear projects previously announced by the New York Power Authority. The governor even boasted that she would build more new nuclear generation, quote, than has been built anywhere in the United States in the last 30 years. Other states are watching New York closely and eyeing similar rapid nuclear expansion. We're joined tonight by 2 outstanding experts who will weigh in on this alarming matter via brief presentations. Dr. Marvin Resnikoff is an international consultant on radioactive waste, a nuclear physicist. Dr. Resnikoff has worked on radioactive issues since 1974. His recent research focus has been on the risk of transporting and storing radioactive nuclear reactor fuel, decommissioning nuclear facilities, and the health impact of radioactive waste from oil and uranium production. He will be exploring some of these themes in his presentation in just a few minutes. And Susan Hito Shapiro will broaden the lens to examine such matters as nuclear power's role in worsening climate disruption, from uranium mining to waste storage, as well as the economic and timing challenges that make nuclear a costly distraction from real solutions. Ms. Hito Shapiro is a New York State environmental attorney who's been researching nuclear energy's emissions and impact on climate change for many years. We're grateful to have both of them with us, and we look forward to a thoughtful and informative discussion. So Marvin, first I want to point out that this week is the 15th anniversary of the disaster at Fukushima. And on that note, I'm turning it over to you for your presentation.
The pro-nuclear media wants you to believe that nuclear power does not heat up the planet, does not produce harmful carbons, and is the solution to our energy needs. These are lies. As Mark Jacobson showed at the last forum, it takes a long time, many years, to design and put into production a nuclear reactor. It's far less expensive and faster to save energy and to use solar panels and wind to produce electricity. Lance mentioned Fukushima. Its anniversary was 2 days ago, 15-year anniversary. Fukushima is where a tsunami sent 30-foot waves onto Japanese land, washed out the reactors, washed out the generating stations, and essentially the reactors were without power. The uranium with fission became 240 radionuclides, particularly strontium-90, cesium-137, and that remained to be decayed and produce heat. And as effect, all the pumps and water circulation ceased and the reactors overheated. Reactor 1 melted down and exploded. The next day, reactor 3 overheated and exploded, and it spewed radionuclides to the northwest, as shown in this slide. So that's an important difference between nuclear and coal and oil, and that is that with this tremendous heat that cannot be turned off. I want to turn to waste heat. All central generating stations, coal, oil, nuclear, boil water to produce steam, to run turbines, and they're only 1/3 efficient. That is to say, 1/3 of that energy goes to produce electricity and 2/3 runs into the environment. How much heat is produced in 60 years operation of a nuclear reactor? 1.58 times 10 to the 18th BTU. Is that a big number? Just to compare, I've looked at how much heat it takes to melt all the Earth's ice. That includes Greenland, it includes Antarctica. So nuclear accounts for 1/5 of all the energy, and then there's coal and oil, and then there's transportation as well. And carbon-14 is also produced in nuclear reactors. Carbon-14, I've calculated the number of assemblies per year produced in most reactors. The number of years, 60 years a reactor would operate, 40 plus 20 more that the NRC is allowing. 400 reactors in the world. I've calculated the total amount of carbon-14 produced in terms of curies, 1.63 million curies. I've compared the United States to what's happening in China. As you see, the United States produces 3 times the electricity in solar and wind than it does in nuclear. And China produces 30 times the amount of electricity produced by solar and wind compared to nuclear. In last year alone, China produced or put online 2.5 gigawatts of new nuclear, but it increased its solar by 275 gigawatts. And for the world as a whole, nuclear capacity was increased by 5.4 gigawatts, but wind energy and solar were increased by 565 kilowatts, which is 100 times the nuclear change. This is from my personal experience. I moved from Vermont to New Hampshire, and I used to go to this church. And the church put on solar panels, and any church or any building can put on solar panels on the roof. And the next slide shows, I'm sorry for all these numbers, but in the bottom right-hand corner, you see approximately 2/3 of the electricity that's used comes from solar, just by putting those solar panels on the roof. In charging my electric car is another example. The cost in Vermont is a half of what it costs in New Hampshire. And the difference is New Hampshire gets most of its electricity from 2 nuclear power plants, Seabrook and Millstone, but Vermont gets its electricity primarily from Hydro-Quebec, wind, and solar. So nuclear increases the cost for the average person who's using electricity. These are where all the nuclear power plants are located in the United States. I want to talk a little about transportation. This is where I'm heading right now. There is nowhere to send the nuclear fuel. And what happens is fuel is put into a fuel pool where it's cooled and shielded from radioactivity. And that's happening everywhere except fuel pools are getting full. And in turn, the nuclear fuel is put into dry storage casks. So the fuel is sealed into a canister, and that's stored inside a concrete silo. And this is what's happening, say, at Connecticut Yankee, where there used to be a nuclear reactor, and now is 58 storage casks. So when the waste repository or storage facility is built somewhere in the West, Department of Energy's method of shipping all this fuel there is primarily by rail. So there are 76 sites in the United States. Over 100,000 tons of nuclear fuel sit at the 76 sites. And you can imagine when a repository is opened, all 76 sites will want to ship their fuel to that site. The way it's shipped is then put onto dry storage casks. And this is for a smaller cask, but this is the transportation cask. Canister is taken out of the silo and put into this transportation cask, which is sitting on a rail car. Or if it's a larger cask, like in the next slide, it would be put into this new Atlas rail car, which consists of 12 different axles. You'll notice an axle on each end, in addition to the axle under the car itself. The preferred method then is to ship all this fuel by rail, but that is a problem at Indian Point. To get the fuel down onto a rail car at Indian Point, one has to do it in one of two ways. One is to put it all on a barge and ship it down to New Jersey and then transfer the fuel into a rail car. I don't know what New York City thinks about having all these cars come down to New York City, but that's one alternative the Department of Energy has selected. Another alternative is to move the cast to the nearest rail siding by long, heavy haul trucks. These are trucks that are at least 150 feet long. So they're not easy to transport this fuel up to a rail car, but it can be done. Fuel would then go up to the local siding. Then the rail car would go up to Albany, where it could cross the Hudson, and then head out west. Depending on the load, either on a single rail car or this 12-axle car, it would then move the fuel to out west. There are a large number of casks that will be moving, at least one rail car and one truck cask per day, and that would continue for at least 15 years. That's what I have to say about it. Other questions?
Wonderful. Thank you so much for that presentation. There's so much to pick out of that, from the dangers of transporting nuclear waste to the opportunity that we are just throwing away by turning away from renewable opportunities. Let me start with a brief round of questions by asking you to talk a little bit more in depth about Fukushima. You mentioned that nuclear is the heat that can't be turned off. And one of the most sobering lessons from Fukushima is that nuclear power can't simply be shut down like other technologies. Can you explain a little bit more in depth why that is?
Yes, nuclear fission produces 240 radionuclides, and they continue to decay over time. So you'd have strontium-90 and cesium-137 are important radionuclides, which have approximately 30-year half-life, and that material will continue to decay over time. So when you turn off the fuel, when you turn off the cooling system, that material continues to decay and produce heat. And that heat eventually will overheat the system. The zirconium cladding around the fuel will explode itself, in addition to the reactor itself burning through, melting down the reactor containment itself.
So just to reiterate, even after a reactor stops producing electricity, it continues producing risk and heat.
That's right.
Okay. Let me take a question from the audience here. Which technology for new power plants has the lowest life cycle greenhouse gas emissions? Nuclear fission, fossil energy, or a pairing of clean energy and clean storage?
The lowest would come from solar panels, obviously.
Another question for Marvin. How far are we from a repository, if ever? Has any country established one?
No country has established them. They're further along is Finland and Sweden. But there is none here in the United States, and there's none in Canada so far. The Department of Energy is in the process of trying to locate a willing participant. I think it's the improper way to actually solve the problem. I think the best way is to look for a geology that's appropriate and then look for a community rather than trying to bribe off a community in the first place.
Here's another audience question, Marvin. Is there an agreed definition of quote unquote clean energy?
Less carbon-14, less carbon in general serves as a blanket around the Earth. And then there's the issue of the heat that's produced on the Earth itself. And that's what I was talking about in the beginning about.
Perhaps what the audience member means is because I have seen this in maps of the United States on a state by state basis, which states have goals for switching to renewable energy or clean energy. And it seems that renewable energy is fairly clear, but for clean energy, I often see nuclear listed under that rubric of clean energy. And it seems that that is certainly disputable that it is clean energy. So I think that might be what the audience member is getting at in the question. Do you want to consider it from that perspective?
Well,
Is there an agreed definition of clean energy that does or does not include nuclear?
no, producing heat is not clean. That serves as, to heat up the climate, to melt the ice in Greenland and Antarctica. So the heat itself is a problem, and also then the radioactivity is a problem.
All right, one more question for Marvin for the moment, and then certainly if we get, we'll take on a few more after Susan gives her presentation and takes a few questions as well. Marvin, building on what you said earlier, even during normal operation, what do nuclear reactors emit besides electricity?
Well, that was raised by Joe Mangannon at the last forum. And it's also by, in terms of the study that was done by Harvard researchers, which showed that there's an increase in the number of health effects near reactors as compared to away from reactors. And I don't know, those studies didn't say why, but reactors produce material that is released into the environment, like tritium, krypton, radon, carbon-14. Those materials are radioactive and also enter the environment.
What Marvin's referring to, for those in the audience, is a study that was issued by Harvard looking at the state of Massachusetts, and I believe it was looking at health conditions within a 30-kilometer radius around nuclear power, and they found that there were higher rates of cancer in the residents living within 30 kilometers of those nuclear plants.
Yes, thanks, Ryan.
All right, now let's turn our attention to our other expert for the evening, Susan Hito Shapiro. Susan, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, and thank you all for joining us today and spending time with us on these important issues. What I'm going to be focusing on today is the nuclear spin, the greenwashing of nuclear energy. I want to make it really clear to everyone here that it is patently untrue that nuclear energy is a zero emissions or carbon-free source of energy. This is just basic physics. This is not opinion, but just fact. Nuclear reactors emit a whole host of pollutants, as Marvin just mentioned: ionizing radiation, thermal waste heat pollution, radioactive CO2 and methane, carbon-14, and radioactive water vapor as tritium. Nuclear reactors also have a large fossil fuel footprint. Yet, despite these irrefutable facts, the nuclear industry has spent billions and years trying to greenwash nuclear energy by falsely representing to politicians and the public that nuclear energy is zero emissions and carbon-free. And in doing so, they've been stealing billions of dollars. Simply, it is a fraud on the public. Nuclear energy does not deserve 1 cent of zero emissions credits simply because they are not zero emissions. New York State and other states have been diverting billions in public funds under the guise of zero emissions credits to nuclear, even though the legislatures have earmarked these funds to build a clean, renewable energy future. Nuclear reactors emit large amounts of ionizing radiation that cause cancer and illness. In the first webinar of this series, Joe Mangano of Radiation and Public Health Project discussed peer-reviewed studies that he and Harvard did showing statistically significant increases in cancer incidences in reactor communities. He also discussed recent reports that show after reactors are shut down, infant mortality and low birth weights significantly decrease. Also, the life cycle of nuclear energy has a very large carbon footprint. All the construction that goes into mining, milling, conversion, enrichment, fuel fabrication, transportation, decommissioning, and nuclear waste storage in perpetuity use an enormous amount of fossil fuels. Just look at these structures. They're all concrete and steel, made using fossil fuels. And after they are used by the nuclear industry, these structures become contaminated with ionizing radiation. This is not a small carbon footprint. I want to make it very clear that it's not just the carbon footprint that we're concerned about, as Marvin discussed. During the electricity production, during the actual moment that nuclear fission produces heat that spins the turbines that makes the electricity, radioactive carbon-14 is released as and emitted from nuclear reactors as radioactive CO2 and methane. These reactors also emit radioactive water vapor, tritium, as steam. Just look, every time you pass a nuclear reactor, you see those white clouds puffing out. That's radioactive steam. That's steam coming out of those reactors. That's heat. That is an emission. They are not zero emissions. And one of the issues is that the nuclear industry knows this, yet they do not monitor these emissions. So they're just not counting. But that doesn't mean that it's not true. It's just a false claim that nuclear is zero emissions or carbon free. I want to just briefly touch on reprocessing, which is now being discussed as what they're going to be using for SMRs, for small modular reactors. The IAEA acknowledged that Krypton-85 is released during reprocessing. It is known to enhance air ionization and interferes with the atmospheric electrical systems and water balance of the Earth's atmosphere. The World Meteorological Organization states that Krypton-85, if it continues to increase, it will change the Earth's magnetic field, formation of cloud condensation, and frequency of lightning, may result and disrupt the Earth's heat balance and precipitation patterns. WISE, the organization out of Europe, which is NEAR's partner, did studies that showed that Krypton-85 is a beta emitter and is capable of ionizing the atmosphere, leading to the formation of ozone in the troposphere. Tropospheric ozone is a greenhouse gas. It damages plants and causes smog and health problems, and is a greenhouse gas that traps heat. It also gives rise to unforeseen effects of climate and weather. This is an image that was taken by an airplane, an aerial photograph, a thermal photograph that was taken when Indian Point was operating. And it shows the thermal pollution being dumped into the Hudson River. This is hot water that was being dumped every single day into the Hudson River while it was operating. This is heat waste. This is the thermal heat waste that's directly impacting our climate, our planet. Every reactor has heat waste. Out of the 10,000 BTUs that is produced to produce 1 kilowatt of energy, 6,600 of those BTUs is wasted. It's not used, and it's dumped into the rivers, the oceans, the streams as hot water and steam. This is directly heating the planet. Nuclear energy is so highly inefficient that and wastes so much heat, it really is not a solution to climate change and should not be considered any part of that solution. As Marvin discussed and Dr. Gordon Edwards stated, that once fission starts, quote, radioactivity cannot be turned off, so heat waste cannot be turned off. This is important to understand this concept, that unlike fossil fuels, which burn once and then turn to cold ash, nuclear fission, once it starts, continues emitting heat until all its half-lives are burned up, and therefore it emits thermal pollution for decades, centuries, and millennium into our waters and our air. Nuclear waste, nuclear heat waste, is thermal pollution. And we have to think about it as heat times time. It's not a snapshot that one day it makes energy and it's hot. We have to think about that it's a continuum of heat. Once it starts, it continues being hot for a very, very long time. So you have to multiply all that heat over time. As Marvin explained earlier, the calculations of roughly 400 nuclear reactors worldwide for 40 years has generated enough BTUs to melt about 25% of the Earth's ice. Yet it's only produced about 11% of the Earth's energy, electricity. That doesn't make any sense. Now, about 40% of the polar ice caps have melted away since 1979. Coincidentally, that happens to be the same year that TMI happened. And after Chernobyl, large quantities of cesium were found in the Arctic ice. And soon after, the Arctic began melting much more rapidly than expected. Nuclear fission is the hottest human activity. It burns hot for a very, very long time. The calculations that we used, that we were discussing about BTUs, is we looked at regular burn-up fuel and not high burn-up fuel, which is much hotter and burns hot for much longer. Also, we didn't look at nuclear weapons and all the nuclear bomb testing, and that heat was not calculated. If we add that into the equation, we're talking about a lot more heat that has been generated by nuclear fission and has impacted the climate. According to the National Institute of Health, a 1 megaton nuclear weapon heats up to about 100 degrees Celsius, 100 million degrees Celsius, I'm sorry. Yet the sun's core is only estimated to be 15 million degrees Celsius. That's very hot for these nuclear reactors to be producing. This heat does not dissipate into the outer space. It gets trapped in our close environment. The combination of nuclear and greenhouse gases, which trap this excess heat, accelerates climate change rapidly. Also, nuclear is not a form of energy that's resilient in a world undergoing climate change. It uses enormous amounts of water and is not reliable during floods, droughts, and storms of increasing size and frequency. Fort Calhoun has been shut down due to flooding. In France and in the US South, every year reactors are shut down because the rivers they use for cooling are too hot. This increased frequency due to climate change, there's more storms and storm surges, which cause nuclear reactors into forced shutdowns, which are very risky and dangerous. Since Fukushima, which is now the anniversary of Fukushima once again, the Pacific Ocean has been growing hotter and hotter as the waste heat from Fukushima is being dumped into the Pacific. And it has resulted in increased in frequency of megastorms throughout the world. About 5 years ago, there were reports in the Times and in other news agencies that the Russians have been disposing their nuclear waste and their nuclear submarines, their old nuclear submarines, under the Arctic ice. The question has to be asked, how much is nuclear contributing to climate change? Just the direct heat from nuclear. And clearly, all this heat makes it clear that nuclear is not a zero emissions form of energy. This image was taken from a 2018 Crain's Business article in which the nuclear industry brags about how profitable politics are for the nuclear industry. It mocks the throwing of billions and billions of dollars of taxpayers' dollars down the drain into the nuclear money pit. The nuclear lobby has been lobbying that their fraud on the public has worked. Today, nuclear is no longer a political issue, since all the politicians on both sides rely on nuclear donations and support nuclear energy and subsidies throughout the country. Nuclear energy is the most subsidized, or one of the most subsidized industries in the country, especially since it is exempt from having insurance because of the Price-Anderson Act, which our politicians keep supporting. So besides blocking a clean energy future, every penny spent on nuclear produces even more unmanageable and costly waste, and for which there is no viable storage solution today. So why are the energy goals that the states like New York have set being met? New York passed landmark climate change laws that with goals of 70% carbon-free energy by 2030, but that has not been met. Why? Simply because of the way the funding's working, because of the nuclear lie that there are zero emissions. In 2016, New York State gave Exelon $7.6 billion to keep the aging reactors on Lake Ontario open from the zero emissions credit program, earmarked for renewables. At the same time, they gave all renewables, solar, wind, geothermal, tidal, efficiencies, battery storage, altogether, only $1 billion. And now they turn around and say, why aren't there more renewables? There isn't enough funding. But even during that time, even with that limited funding, renewables produced 2 new gigawatts of energy, while nuclear, with the $7.6 billion that it received, produced no new gigawatts of energy. Now Governor Hochul and the PSC have approved another $33 billion from the Zero Emissions Energy Credit Fund to keep the nuclear reactors going on Lake Ontario. They did this without conducting any type of cost-benefit analysis or environmental impact study. And now there's a proposal for another $100 billion to fund the fantasy of experimental, untested, non-existent, non-existent SMRs to be placed all over the state, potentially even at Indian Point. And what's happening in New York State is that we have the highest energy bills, or some of the highest energy bills in the nation. And all this partially because of all this funding for nuclear, which derails New York's energy goals for a clean energy future. US federal law dictates that all ads must not be misleading and be, when appropriate, be backed by scientific evidence. The scientific evidence that nuclear is not zero emission is clear and unrefutable. The Lanham Act allows civil lawsuits for false advertisement that misrepresent the nature, characteristics, and qualities of goods and services. In 1998, Public Citizen, along with other group of environmental groups, challenged the NEI's advertising campaign for greenwashing nuclear energy as being environmentally clean and that it did not pollute air or water. The Better Business Bureau held that NEI's advertising campaign was false and inaccurate. Unfortunately, this ruling was not enforced. So based on that same kind of false and deceptive advertising, the nuclear lobby has successfully bamboozled elected officials over and over again out of billions of dollars of taxpayer money. This is the facts of physics that nuclear fission, by its very nature, emits large amounts of ionizing radiation, thermal pollution, carbon greenhouse gases, and has a larger carbon footprint. Nuclear energy is just not zero emissions. The government spending all of our money giving nuclear zero emissions credit is a lost opportunity for the state as throwing our good money after bad on nuclear subsidies and locking us into a dirty future, a dirty energy future of extractive, unsustainable energy, as fossil fuels and nuclear go hand in hand. We need to win the court of public opinion. To do that, we need to educate the public and the politicians that nuclear is not zero emissions, not carbon-free, and not part of a solution to climate change. The fraud on the public that nuclear is zero emissions has to be stopped. It has handicapped the implementation of cost-effective and sustainable clean energy. We need to level the playing field. We need to get out their message that nuclear is not the answer to climate change. To win the court of public opinion, we need to make it clear that it is a fraud on the public, that they've been telling the world that nuclear is zero emissions. It just isn't. We don't need nuclear or fossil fuels. One is heroin and one is meth. And we have a solution. We have solar, wind, geothermal, all the renewable energy solutions working together, complementing each other, will solve our energy future in a clean way. As Mark Jacobson discussed in the first webinar of this series, we don't need nuclear energy or fossil fuels to power AI data centers, but rather geothermal and advanced geothermal are significantly more cost-effective, efficient, and quick to come online. Geothermal does not create nuclear waste and is available nearly everywhere. Geothermal uses far less water and is much less polluting than nuclear or fossil fuels. And it's already being used by Microsoft and Meta for data centers. So the argument that we need nuclear for data centers is a false red herring. So we need to stop the fraud. We need to stop the greenwashing of nuclear. It is not an answer to climate change. Thank you very much.
And thank you as well, Susan, so much for that thought-provoking presentation. And like Marvin's talk, you've raised a number of alarming points that call for further inquiry. Just a note, aligned with what you were talking about in your presentation, today the Trump administration repealed the endangerment finding, which establishes that climate change is harmful to the health of humans and the environment. So we're in a very odd and dangerous predicament at the moment. Let me start with a question for you, Susan, about, and there are also some questions from the audience here, but let me start with a question for you about New York State, which is the most immediate concern on the horizon for this particular forum. Tell us a little bit about how to view the presentation you just gave through the eyes and through the lens of what is coming up on the dockets for New York State with Governor Hochul promising to add 4 additional gigawatts to the 1 gigawatt that's already been approved.
Well, it's shocking that the way they pushed it through to begin with, they pushed it through without doing any of the required analysis. They did no cost benefit analysis and no environmental studies to grant that funding. And we need now, as we had 450,000 people sign petitions to get Governor Hochul to sign a bill not to dump tritium into the Hudson River, we need that kind of action right now in the state to stop this. Our electricity bills in New York State are extraordinarily high. This is only going to make them higher. This money just doesn't come from anywhere. It comes from our rates. That's where they're getting the money. And the Public Service Commission is a rogue agency at this point, and they'll do anything for the industry. This is a very sad situation with our politicians, that they seem to be beholden to the nuclear industry. And the only way we can turn this around, I believe, is really educating the public and getting in front of our elected officials so they understand that nuclear is not a solution to climate change, that nuclear contributes greatly to climate change. It's actually a big contributor to climate change. So
Zeroing in on Indian Point, which you referenced in the Hudson River, technically the Hudson River is actually not a river, correct? It flows both ways, and so I believe I believe it's an estuary, and the tritiated water that comes from Indian Point, which is just 36 miles north of New York City, has been released and is continuing to be released into that water, where it's harmful not only to the populations that depend on it for water. I believe there are 5 communities in the Westchester area on both sides of the river that depend on it for actual drinking water, but it's also harmful to the fish population that lives there, and it's unpredictable in terms of its migratory patterns because of the river flowing both ways. Can you speak a little bit about the dangers of Indian Point, which is closed? But to Marvin's point, even if a nuclear generating power plant is closed, the wastewater is still going to have impact for generations to come.
Yes, well, Indian Point is still leaking into the Hudson River. It's been leaking into the Hudson River for many, many years, and most reactors around the whole country and world are leaking in some way. The technology to contain nuclear radiation doesn't really exist. It's very corrosive. But Indian Point is a river that flows both ways.
The Hudson, yeah.
The Hudson, I meant the Hudson is a river that flows both ways. And it actually, New York City's backup water supply, they don't use it regularly, but if there was an emergency, they would be relying on the Hudson River as well. And there was a desalination plant that was proposed right across from Indian Point in the Havistraw Bay some years ago. And when they did the pilot plant, they found radiation on the other side of the reverse osmosis barrier. So we know that the tritium and the strontium is in the river from the reactors. Now, today we have Lake Ontario, where most of the reactors in New York State are, and the algae blooms from the heat in Lake Ontario and the other issues that are impacting the fish and the populations up there are also enormous. In the Hudson, we're dealing with the endangered sturgeon that the Havistraw Bay is their nursery. So there is so many environmental impacts and of operating nuclear reactors, but once they're closed, you have the problem that nuclear waste continues giving heat and radio. It's not a closed environment. It keeps radiating.
Here's another question from the audience. Sorry, I'm just scrolling through the questions. There's so many questions from the audience that are all so good. I'm just trying to pick out some good ones here. This one, I believe this is for Marvin. Have you actually conducted life cycle emissions assessments of nuclear projects as per ISO standards?
No is the answer.
Okay. Any elaboration there? Or has anyone? No. Okay. That is additionally alarming. Is geological storage that permanently protects from radiation and explosions possible or impossible? I think Susan just hinted at this. And this is for both of you.
well, as far as I know, Marvin might be able to know more about this. As far as I know, there hasn't been a place that has been found to be geologically stable enough anywhere to because the problem with nuclear waste is it's radioactive and has to be kept away from life for longer than human life has existed on this planet. So we don't know how it reacts to materials, basically. But Marvin can probably speak about this in more depth.
Well, the issue is if there's water involved, essentially, and you put heat into the ground, which is what the radioactive waste will be for many years, for millions of years, essentially you set up convective currents so that the water actually mixes with the waste material. So you have to find an area where there's no water involved. And I think the method that they're using is incorrect. They're first looking for a community that will take the waste, and then they're trying to determine whether that's acceptable from a scientific point of view, rather than first looking for acceptable geology and then looking for the communities within.
Let me move on to another one here. Thank you, Marvin, for that. This is for both of you. Can you say a little bit more about how big a factor nuclear thermal pollution is compared to other factors in global warming? You certainly mentioned it. I think you both mentioned it in your presentations. But how is that in terms of contributions to overall global warming? What is the impact of that thermal pollution?
I think in my slide I showed that, and Susan mentioned this, approximately a fifth of the energy is due to nuclear, and then there is coal and oil and gas and transportation and all those other factors. So I don't know what all these other factors are, but they will be at least as big as nuclear. So
But you're saying the nuclear is about 20%.
All the factors are contributing. It's no better or worse.
Yeah.
Susan, for you, do any organizations regulate heat emissions?
As far as I know, no. Most of this is not monitored. There's many things many of the emissions coming out of nuclear reactors are not monitored. And going to slightly to answer that prior question, the impact of the emissions from nuclear, the heat emissions from nuclear specifically, you have to understand that that's being generated on the planet, and then it's being trapped by the greenhouse gas effect. So that heat doesn't go anywhere. That heat is staying on the planet. Every day, heat is being produced. More heat is being produced. We're heating the planet directly. So I don't think there's been a direct, as far as I know, there haven't been any other studies about this. I know Marvin and I looked for studies and we couldn't really find any that have been done yet. And one of the big problems with nuclear is a lot of the things that should be looked at have never been looked at. Even the health impacts have not been looked at. Everything is based on a theoretical calculation that they thought about in the 60s and 70s. But today, nuclear has been operating for a long time. We can look at epidemiological data and review what's been going on, and it hasn't been done.
Excellent point. Ohio has amended, also from the audience here, Ohio has amended their revised code to declare both natural gas and nuclear power clean, green energy. Has New York legally declared nuclear green energy?
No, but except for that they're giving it zero emissions credits. They haven't declared it. The legislature has not weighed in at all on this issue of nuclear being clean and green. In fact, in the scoping of the act, the Clean Energy Act, they absolutely omitted nuclear. They purposefully omitted nuclear as not being clean or green.
For Marvin, Can you talk about how nuclear waste is not just the spent fuel from the reactor, but voluminous amounts of other types of radioactive waste materials that cannot be recycled? So, by definition, nuclear cannot be part of a future, more circular resource economy because it is highly unsustainable. That is everything I just read is from an audience question.
Well, it's true that during the operation of a nuclear reactor, it's not just the fuel itself that becomes radioactive. It's the water, it's the reactor vessel, it's all the low-level waste that's produced that has to be sent somewhere, to some landfill. All those materials have to be taken care of.
And one thing I think that you were hinting at in your presentation, although I'm not sure that I heard it said, so maybe you can zero in on this, Marvin, is that not only is there a danger in not only are there extra emissions that come from transportation of these radioactive materials, but the danger that because of the frequency of accidents on trains and transportation, that there could be large impacts on communities when there is an accident, such as I believe it's East Palestine, Ohio. I don't know that was nuclear waste, but I know that it was toxic waste. But speak a little bit about the dangers of transporting this waste. And I believe one other additional aspect to this question, Marvin, if you don't mind, is that there are also laws that prohibit the transportation of certain radioactive materials, such as in San Onofre, California, where that material is buried in aging casks on a beach, subject to king tides in a area so tectonic it's nicknamed Earthquake Bay. So tell us a little bit about the dangers of transportation all around.
Well, is it possible for you to show my next slide? That after the ones that you showed, there's another slide next to it. Can you show that or not?
Beth, can we go back to the to Marvin's slides and advance to the one past the one where we last saw? Thank you so much.
All the way to the end.
It's last one.
It answers your question. That's it. I wanted to
Perfect.
in this slide, I wanted to show that this is the number of fires per freight train mile. And as you see, over time, more and more, there are more and more fires per freight train mile. And that's important for accidents involving transportation casks, nuclear casks, because if they're caught in a fire, and there have been some horrific fires, and you mentioned one of them, but there are some horrific fires that have taken place, and the casks will not withstand them. The casks are only designed to withstand a half-hour fire at a 1475 degrees Fahrenheit, not fire of organic material like oil, which will burn at 1800 degrees Fahrenheit. So the casks are not designed to withstand long duration fires, and that could be very serious concern.
Next question from the audience. Does nuclear waste heat runoff increase the temperature of the world's water supply? And can we measure how much?
We know that around Indian Point, for example, I could speak to that. The heat waste that was being dumped into the Hudson River every day was raising it anywhere from 10 to 18 degrees. And there's some reactor sites where it's as high as 25 degrees hotter. And especially when you're dealing with already warm waters, the raising that heat makes it, first of all, you can't run the reactor. That's what happens in France and in Georgia every year. So the amount of heat worldwide is what the calculations that Marvin talked about. but specifically where it is, it's right at reactor sites, but that water then is joins all the other water.
Right. There's only one ocean technically because they all flow into each other, and all rivers, most rivers flow into ocean. So any waste that is in one body of water, whether it's evaporated through normal meteorological processes, is going to end up in other oceans. And when we're already dealing, as you said, with acidification of oceans and blanching of coral reefs and things like that, and the impact it's having on marine life and the economic opportunities and the health opportunities for our seafood and those professions is immense. Marvin, any thoughts on that?
No.
Okay.
Well,
Please rate, this is a question from the audience, please rate fossil, nuclear, and renewable on the ability to provide the power needed at the most effective and least cost. Can renewables provide what is needed?
well, it does in the United States 3 times as much electric generation is from solar and wind than it is from nuclear power plants, and they can be produced much faster. As Mark has pointed out at the last forum, it can produce much faster. And pouring money into nuclear is simply prevents us from using solar.
It seems foolhardy as a wasted resources in addition to the amount of time it would take to properly construct these even small modular reactors, up to is it about 12 to 17 years to make one safe?
Nobody knows at this point. It's experimental. Nothing's been approved. They don't know how long it will take.
But the thing is that it's the gigawatts that are produced, not the size of each of these reactors. It's the gigawatts that are produced that is a function then of the energy.
Another audience question related to what you just said, Marvin. Do you have a comparison of the cost per kilowatt hour of nuclear versus solar?
I don't have it off the top of my head. I tried to point out simply what's happening in my own experience in Vermont and New Hampshire, and how it's more expensive now in New Hampshire, and that's even before Eversource gets another 70% increase in its rate. So it's a two or 3 times as much as expensive in New Hampshire as it is in Vermont.
Yeah, I just read a study this morning. I'm trying to remember where the study was, that the gigawatts for nuclear runs about $80 and versus renewables is $15 to $20. So it's significantly different. And the issue really is, yes, solar, wind, geothermal, the renewables can power the planet. We can get enough energy. The problem, once again, is the funding. I know I'm a farmer in New York State. If I want to do community solar, I've been offered to, take 20 acres of land and for 20 years to put it under solar. And other farmers have been too. But the amount of money that we're being offered is less than what it costs to pay taxes. So it doesn't make sense for any farmer to take their land out of production that they can't even cover their taxes. Whereas nuclear is getting $7.6 billion. If that money was going to solar in New York State and farmers were being given a living wage to put their money into solar, we would be there already. It would take no time if the money was in the right place.
But it's also important, some advanced countries like Germany have simply stopped the production of nuclear power, and they were able to exist. They get their energy from other means. They get it from solar and from wind.
I believe Denmark gets most of their power from wind on a daily basis.
Right.
Yeah.
This is a question, Susan, I'm going to give this one to you. With the onslaught of nuclear issues, including funding and gutting the Environmental Protection Agency, what are the top 2 or 3 issues that we should be focusing on as activists?
That's a really good question. I personally think the biggest, there are many issues, obviously, the health impacts, but right now, I think our biggest issue to be able to move that money away from nuclear is to educate the public that nuclear is not a solution to climate change. Nuclear causes climate change. Nuclear is not zero emissions. It's not carbon free. The public has been brainwashed and greenwashed into believing that nuclear is a solution to climate change. Most people do not know that what nuclear actually emits, that it's not emissions free. So I think what we're talking about here today is really important. And it's really about we have to move the funding away from nuclear. It will bankrupt our country. It will bankrupt every state that's doing it. Georgia went bankrupt over building the last Vogtle plant, the last reactor that was built in the United States. And the electricity bills in Georgia are outrageous. New York State has high electricity bills. Georgia has even as high, if not higher, electricity bills. So it is not a financially wise decision for nuclear. And I think it's both the finances, the health, and the actual truth that nuclear is not a solution to climate change.
We have one more question here, and then I have some closing remarks. But what are the top two or three things we should be focusing on as activists? Marvin, do you have any thoughts on that? What we should be focusing on in terms of activism, or in terms of speaking out or pointing things out to the public?
I wanted to say one point about reprocessing in the state of New York. New York subsidized the reprocessing industry in West Valley, New York. And I think at the time, we're talking about the 1963 period when the New York State provided on the order of $100 million, which was a lot of money at that time. But the cost to actually decommission the West Valley reprocessing plant was paid by the federal government, and that is over $5 billion now and still running. So that's another example of how New York State has subsidized the industry that Susan has talked about.
Yeah,
It
and
seems analogous to on a global level. I know that not nuclear, but the fossil fuel industry has gotten $7.1 trillion in subsidies that, had they not received those, would have made renewables much more attractive. So this divesting or diverting money toward these not clean, dangerous, or otherwise unhealthy for the planet, unhealthy for human civilization sources. If we instead gave subsidies to safer ones and healthier ones and renewable ones, they would again look much more attractive and as Susan said, already be in place.
nuclear and fossil fuels are the only socialism we have really in this country. They're funded by public funds, and whereas, what would be good for the environment is not. And as Marvin pointed out, West Valley is an ongoing nightmare in New York State. It is, the cleanup of nuclear has to be calculated in the costs. It's not calculated. And in terms of activism, we need to get our elected officials. Maybe the real focus is we have to get money out of politics, because as long as money's in politics, the elected officials are being bought by the nuclear industry. That is one of our biggest problems. Even very good elected officials on other issues are pro-nuclear because their campaigns are heavily funded by the nuclear industry. So that's a big problem that we have.
Well, here's a new question, Susan, that dovetails and piggybacks on what you were just talking about, but love to get your reaction to this one. Again, audience question here. Although the nuclear power renaissance is being sold to the general public as a source of carbon-free baseload energy, might its true purpose be to provide the industrial, academic, governmental complex needed for nuclear weapons production and the nuclear navy with which to deliver them? If this is the ultimate driver of the nuclear enterprise, then cost, timeless, health impacts, and nuclear waste are immaterial to national security.
This might be a better Marvin question, because this is really about how much stockpile of nuclear waste do we already have? How much more do we need? All of it can be turned into. Yeah.
Can
you repeat that, Marvin?
I said, how much more plutonium do we need? How many more bombs do we need?
Yeah.
There's a separate industry going on now in Sandia Laboratory that is refurbishing the nuclear weapons. And I'm just unclear, and I think most public is unclear as to why we need more plutonium and why we need reprocessing to begin with. That makes the nuclear even more expensive than it is right now.
Got it. Well, that is going to conclude our symposium today. Apologies if we didn't get to your questions, but we will endeavor to answer them by email. So look for the address on the invite for today's symposium, and please do send us the questions that you have that we did not have time for today. A recording of the symposium will be available to watch early next week. Also, on that same get that same information off that website and off the invite that you used to be here. And be sure to tune into the third forum in the series later this month on February 26th at 2 p.m. Eastern. That will feature Gordon Edwards, which will be titled "Debunking New Nuclear Hopium: Small Modular Nuclear Reactors, Advanced Nuclear Reactors, and Fusion." Have a great weekend, everybody.